Good evening. Welcome to the third evening lecture at the School of Architecture this spring. As I'm sure you all know, next week is a long overdue spring break, finally, which all of us could use. But we return the week after on Friday, April 3rd, which is the graduate open house. Will be a lecture by Mark Lee and Sharon Johnston of Johnston Mark Lee from Los Angeles. And then on Monday, right after that, April 6th, will be Carme Pinos from Barcelona. And then we'll continue on after that. Tonight, it gives me great pleasure to welcome K. Michael Hayes to UIC, and also to take this opportunity to recognize the Graham Foundation for co-sponsoring tonight's lecture, and thank Sarah Hurley, who should be here at some point. Director of the Graham for the Foundation's continued support for our events as well as others throughout the city. So thank you to the Graham and Sarah for making tonight's event co-possible. Michael has been teaching at Harvard's Graduate School of Design for over 20 years, which I'm sure is hard for him to believe, where he's currently the Elliott Noyes Professor of Architectural Theory and co-director of graduate doctoral programs. Since 2000, he was the first adjunct curator of architecture at the Whitney Museum, where he launched the exhibition Starting with the Universe on the work of Buckminster Fuller, which is now on display at the Museum of Contemporary Art, just opening on Saturday here in Chicago, and more on that in a second. But I always want to call it, the world is not enough. You make it kind of a Bond thing. In some ways, Michael is a one-person discourse machine. He has been if not the, central figure in repositioning the European modernist avant-gardes in relation to contemporary architectural practices, allowing each part of that historical equation to define and redefine the other. His first book, Modernism and the Post-Humanist Subject, resituates work of Hans Meyer and Ludwig Hilbersheimer and characterizes them as projecting a new form of architectural subjectivity. In other words, they offered a new form of collective audience, and that would be in contrast to the way in which more traditionalist critics of postmodernism would understand that modernist work and dismiss it simply as being anti-humanist. In other words, Michael returned to those modernist figures, or gave to them, you could say, a contemporary positive project. At the same time, Michael almost single-handedly rediscovered the 70s before it was a hip thing to do, and also gave us key anthologies in the birth of contemporary critical architectural design and theory, namely Architectural Theory since 1968 and the Opposition's Reader anthology. Finally, he's taken the task of situating more recent design work with books on Diller and Scofidio, John Haig, Peter Eisenman, and even much younger practices as evidenced in the pages of Assemblage magazine, which Michael founded and edited for its 41-issue run from 1986 to 2001. In his many roles as educator, historian, critic, editor, curator, and so on, Michael has been extremely generous to those designers and writers who have followed him, and I personally have to thank him for joining my dissertation committee at the last possible moment, because there was no one at the time at the University of Chicago who had any idea what I was doing. And so I thank Michael for joining the committee then. That was the PhD version of phone friend. I didn't take 50-50, I didn't need that. It's also nice to have Michael here tonight, sort of coincidence maybe of having two historians back-to-back last week. 1 week ago, Bob Rubin was here. And I think it's interesting to see the ways in which architectural historians and architects reinvent previous architectural figures and for what ends. So Harry Weiss last week in terms of Bob's talk, and Bucky Fuller this week. So I'd like to take the unorthodox beginning, which would be rude unless someone was your friend, of beginning the lecture with a question as opposed to waiting to the end, which is simply, why Fuller now? Because in many ways, you could say that the Fuller reception is almost overdetermined at this point in time, at this particular historical juncture. In other words, there is, of course, the environmental, sustainable Fuller, yawn, the geometric intricacy Fuller, of the parametric hexagon honeycomb set, yuck, the mapping datascape Fuller, double yawn, and last but not least, the anti-architectural Fuller of the PhD gray room crowd used to critique contemporary design, double yuck. After seeing the show, and so you could say really it's odd in a way, because to say that Fuller, if nothing else, was a polemicist against specialization, and it's odd that now Fuller and his legacy come into revival exactly at a moment in an era of total specialization. After seeing the show, however, what seems to be missing, or maybe what we're in need of, is the energetically naive Fuller, whose craziest inventions associate him more with Chuck Jones's Wile E. Coyote, with the simple difference that the Acme company of the cartoon figure has been replaced by the equally pervasive and inexplicable Dymexian corporation of the other. I think if you saw yesterday the Tribune and Blair Caden's review of the Fuller exhibit, it seems to parallel, you could say, the trend toward the specialist Fuller, by suggesting that architects today should complete Fuller's project by adding practicality and placemaking. In other words, to not do Fuller. You could say by vimifying Fuller. But I think that the last thing that this city needs is more pragmatism and more placemaking. And really, it's the generalist lesson that some of us want to extend, and also what I hope Michael wants to extend, which is to engage the excessive speculative and global ambition again for architecture. But we will see in a second. Please join me in welcoming the ever dynamic, ever maximum, dynamite, K. Michael Hayes.
Thanks very much, No, I tell you about that. I really appreciated the one thing of rediscovering the 70s, but I'll tell you what, if you teach the same course over and over again, at some point you'll be rediscovering something. So I actually started teaching the 70s not long after the 70s. That was a problem. And on the Fuller show, because it was a big museum show, we absolutely thought the time was right in terms of popular reception, because of we saw in Fuller sort of precedents for issues of ecology, of globalization, of information. There's no doubt about that. But I think my own interest in Fuller, and I think what came in, and Fuller is not someone that I think I would have been attracted to look at as a historical project if it hadn't come up as an exhibition. But as we got into the archive and got into the Fuller material, I do think that what was important for me was that Fuller was a new way of thinking totalities. Fuller was still teaching us to think totalities at a time when the world, just when the world seemed to be breaking up into specialized disciplines, as Bob said, and practices, dividing itself into unrelated objects and forces and events. And he insisted on not just the interconnectedness, but the significant interconnectedness of things otherwise thought to be disparate, detached, or just irrelevant. Very, very small things, and recent sort of discoveries in nanotechnology and bioengineering have proved some of that thinking correct, or very, very vast and complex things like the universe. I want to read the excerpt that gave us the title of the show, Starting with the Universe. This is Fuller. I did not set out. Sorry, I've forgotten the next slide. I did not set out to design a house that hung from a pole, or to manufacture a new type of automobile, invent a new system of map projection, develop geodesic domes, or energetic, synergetic geometry. I started with the universe as an organization of energy systems of which all our experiences and possible experiences are only local instances. It was that kind of, Fuller often does not make sense to me in his writings, but it was that kind of proclamation that made a lot of sense to me. I'll just show you very quickly the installation, just one shot of the installation at the Whitney Museum. It's really a shame that not many people will get to see both installations because you learn very, very different things from the way it was installed here. And I think Elizabeth and Tricia at the MCA did a really great job. In what we think is the very first drawing where Fuller started to put his ideas onto paper, it's this very naive, almost cartoonish drawing that he called Lightful, which appeared early in 1927. The scale of the idea is already global, at least in a kind of obvious way. The direction of thinking, as he calls it, is from inside out. That is, from the local molecular event to the larger system in which that event's embedded. And the prevailing architectural feature is the central vertical support. Notice this will be the diagram that organizes Fuller's entire career up until the geodesic dome. Note how the concentric circles delineate bands from the Earth, bands emanating from the Earth, in which there's a strange array of objects. You won't be able to see them all. It's not a great slide, I apologize. A pair of high voltage towers emerges opposite a pagoda. In between rises a lighthouse, a skyscraper, an obelisk, and a ship with a tall transmission tower. Floating between those towers are vertical objects or an airplane, sailboat, collapsible stool, bird, tennis racket, umbrella, and a steamer trunk. Now, all of these objects, we couldn't figure this out, but all of these objects seem to be associated either with structural tension, the tennis racket, the collapsible stool, the umbrella, or with mobility, the bird, the airplane, the boat. And then finally the text at the edges that you can't see. Time, metal, mechanics. Time, exquisite light. Time, slow matter. Time, fellowship, production. Now, at the moment, there are just so many sort of objects of desire without any system to hold them together, not making much sense. But Fuller is already beginning to conceptualize a system, a global system in terms of movements, distances, patterns, and intensities in an abstract diagram that I want to call geological. Now, by geological, I don't mean just like gemstones and soil management, of course, but rather a logic or a system that is centered on the Earth, geological, is centered on the Earth as an environment and a planet in a cosmos. Right after this, in this drawing, which was the first drawing he published of this system, there's a more narrative, a more coherent narrative depicted. The drawing shows what he called one world island, that is, it shows the world in a single landmass, as a single landmass in a single ocean. We see 4D houses, those little towers, the one you first see the one at the North Pole. These are housing towers with 10 decks suspended from a central mast. In very unlikely places like the Arctic Circle, Siberia, Sahara Desert, the Amazon forest. These 4D houses are discrete, controlled environments. They would be self-sustaining, he thought, sort of dwelling machines placed around the Earth. The towers are surrounded by what he called the air ocean, as well as the water ocean. And through both those oceans, airships, boats, and planes would travel, moving along great circles, which means moving over the poles rather than just around the equators, which Fuller was one of the first to conceptualize a kind of air travel that would go over the poles. And connecting these towers, he envisioned a transportation system connecting all these towers. So globalization, transportation, flows of information and energy, and the exchange of resources are already, this is still 1927, 28, already part of his sort of geological system. Now, this was not architecture, and I don't think this is architecture as some of us would still like to think it. In a famous 1983 film interview, Philip Johnson was very clear that Buckminster Fuller should not be described as an architect. Johnson said Bucky Fuller was no architect, even though he kept pretending he was, and it was very annoying. Now, for Johnson, the reason Fuller was not an architect was because he did not have style. Now, we wouldn't put it that way now. We might say that his work was not a signifying practice, or that it was a symbolic representation, or something like that. But the point would be the same, is that Fuller is not concerned with architecture as code, architecture as a set of codes through which culture is produced and organized. He's not concerned with the formal arrangements handed down through history that confer meaning to viewers who can read those codes. As Johnson says, he doesn't have style. Rather, for him, at least at first, it was weight alone that was an index to a building's worth, because it was an index to its efficiency in terms of use of materials. But also, he thought a lightweight building promoted new kinds of habitation. Now, I want to just remind you, and I'll do this very, very quickly, we do have to place Fuller in context. He was not the only one at this. It doesn't take away anything of his originality to remember that he's not the only one who was doing kind of suspended towers that would actually eventually accrete into entire cities, or single buildings made up of lightweight, very advanced materials. You recognize the Elizisky. This is Hannes Meyer, and I like very much this comparison with a single family version of the 4D tower with Meyer's Peterschule in Basel. But what was different, it just shows that the difference is that the European avant-garde, which we might compare these early projects with, were concerned with codes. The lightweight constructions symbolically countered this kind of moribund monumentality of traditional architecture. They were cultural critiques. They used form as disruptions, as dissonance, inserted into an environment as so-called critical objects. They're encoded as criticisms of traditional proposals in a way that Hannes Meyer rightly called propagandistic. Now, it's not that Fuller didn't understand propaganda. You'll see in the exhibition in some of the vitrines reams of studies of logos with which to market and brand, in contemporary terms, the 4D houses. But that wasn't, so he understood propaganda, but he didn't understand using architecture, let's say, as propaganda. For example, another example is his use of the Zeppelin. We know how the Soviets thought of the Zeppelin, and also here the similar kind of power, electricity tower, as symbols of kind of the new world. Fuller thought of the Zeppelin in much more practical terms. In order to, so the 4D tower would be manufactured off-site in a single factory under a single contract, no specialized disciplines. Here manufactured more like Henry Ford's car. The tower would then be airlifted by the Zeppelin. No, first the Zeppelin would come to the site, drop a bomb, creating an enormous crater in the earth. Then a second Zeppelin would come along with the tower like a kind of tree and a root ball and drop it down into the crater, and then some workers just kick some dirt in around it, and within, Fuller imagined, 3 hours, you have a tower for 10 families. So this is so propaganda perhaps in a different kind of sense. In the 4D tower, suspended floors and walls from the central mast made it feasible that all of the equipment in the house, including elevators, air conditioning, bathroom units, waste disposal, laundry, and cooking, could be housed. As I said, it would be manufactured under a single contract. And I think unlike I don't know of any other architect at this time, he also imagined that the building could be disassembled when it became obsolete. You see the crane in almost all these drawings. There's always a crane at the top, and the crane obviously was not used only for construction. Indeed, in the version I tell you, it was not used for construction at all, but for disassembly. As new technologies emerged, or as the parts of the building became obsolete, the building could take itself apart with these cranes and replace the obsolete units. But the most important thing to me, again, goes back to this idea of a kind of totalization. For Fuller, what was important is that the single tower was simply a unit in a much vaster network of kind of organized flows of energy and information. Listen to the way he describes the tower. The subsidiary systems dwelling devices, that's these manufactured towers, resulted to comprehensive processing or equivalent to electronic tubes which may be plugged into the greater regenerative circuits of electronic communication systems. This is typical Fuller, right? The language. House, in quotes, in comprehensive designing, would be as incidental to the world-around network dwelling service as is the telephone receiver instrument to the energy processing in a communication systems. It would be in turn embedded within the larger systems of industry, itself within the universal systems of macrocosmically and microcosmically pertinent evolutions. The translation is that the house is part of a much larger system. Fuller insisted that this fundamental 4D machine also could be, that the fundamental diagram of the 4D machine could be found at work at the level of the individual house or the collective dwelling and on up to larger national aggregates and to the planet. But it is made up of nothing more than connections of energy to part, of information to part, of information to information. It obeys this geological diagram that organizes functions and guides multiple interactions and interconnections of different matters. I want to show you a very short clip of Fuller presenting the single-family version of this project at Marshall Field's department store, which is actually Marshall Field's paid for the sort of wordsmith that came up with Dymaxion, the logo. I don't understand completely the connection with Marshall Field's, but here, I don't yet have it. I think the point I wanted to make here was that, and you can imagine someone like Philip Johnson looking at this drawing, right? He did a lot of it, you'll see these in the show, a lot of sort of decorative versions, or had other people, we think his wife did this painting, had other people do these kind of decorative versions of the house, desperately trying to make it, to make it sellable. And also, I just wanted to show you quickly the logo for Dymaxion that he keeps evolving. We can get, sorry. We had the sound earlier. Try again.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a first and very crude paper model of a house designed for industrial reproduction. Its requirements must be that it should be proof against fire, flood, tornado, earthquake, electrical storms, marauders. It must be proof against drudgery, that is, in it must be accessories with which a housewife can accomplish all her house cleaning within 15 minutes. The house must be proof against harm to children, so the children need not be done in. That is, children can fall on the pneumatic floors. The shock of their fall is absorbed by the elasticity of the air, and the child is not hurt. The children can jump at the break-proof windows without breaking the glass or without falling out. It is hoped that this form of life-saving may make possible a proper contemplation of the strangeness of the design, so that it may be confidently expected that if we can come at a new truth in design, that it can also be harmoniously presented and a new aesthetic of appreciation of this architecture arrive at.
So you heard the part about the children could fall on the pneumatic floor and run against the glass. But the point I want to make, again, is that the 4D dwelling machine is nothing but its connections of energy, communication, transportation. Now, it was the historian Rainer Banham who became later the single most important advocate in architecture for Fuller, of course, in this famous theory and design in the first machine age, but this wasn't until 1960. But Banham gets something I look back at the theory and design, and Banham gets something very close to what I'm trying to suggest. Let me just quote a couple of sentences. He said, Fuller shared his aim. Oh, so here's where Banham is comparing Fuller to the futurist architects, especially Santillana. He said, Fuller also shared with Santillana the aim of harmonizing environment and man, and of exploiting every benefit of science and technology. Furthermore, the idea of a central core distributing services through the surrounding space, there's a concept that strikingly echoes Boccioni's field theory of space, with objects distributing lines of force through their surroundings. Now, that final point, this idea of being distributed lines of force through their surroundings, is remarkably suggestive, even though Banham doesn't develop it. In his review of Banham's book, Alan Cahoon further sort of dramatized the stakes that he said that Fuller, he was arguing against Banham, that Cahoon says Fuller questions the validity of architecture itself, that Fuller's work could yield only the image of a technique that has reached an optimum of undifferentiation. But even though he's highly critical of Fuller, Cahoon continues. In Fuller's domes, the forms are identified by their lines of force, resembling those of high Gothic structures where a framework alone defines the volume. The forms are absorbed back into process. Now, of course, Cahoon is using this to criticize Fuller and saying it challenges the very validity of architecture. What I'm suggesting is that Cahoon and Banham get it right, is that this is an architecture that tries to conceptualize fundamental forces, whether they be energy flows, economic flows of capital, distribution of resources, and tries to find the shape that those forces can be mapped into. That is actually a mapping of the lines of force. Now, what Cahoon, of course, couldn't recognize in his description was that by dealing with these purely functional elements, forces, and their relations in very different domains, Fuller's thought comes very close to what Gilles Deleuze would later call transcendental empiricism. I wish I hadn't done that, but because it's too easy to kind of throw that. But transcendental empiricism suggested itself because it's it's a way of thinking that's anti-representational, that's vitalistic, and it kind of remains kind of open-ended. This is how Fuller put what I'm calling transcendental empiricism. The everywhere and every when, non-simultaneously intertransforming, differently enduring, differently energized, independently episodic and overlapping, eternally regenerative scenario of universe's laws. Now, that seems to be just about right. In any case, Fuller's is not just, this diagram I'm talking about is not just an abstraction that transcends all experience. It's rather a kind of a diagram that organizes experience. Now, just quickly, to complete in a more kind of empirical way this system of flows of transportation and now also people, he needed a vehicle, a device that would get people and goods from one of these powers to another in this globalized system. And this is just to insist that the famous Dymaxion car, that one of the main objects that Fuller is known for, should not be considered alone as just an automobile, but rather as part of this globalized system. The very first version, the 4D version, was intended to have inflatable wings that could fly short distances and also move in water. That version, of course, never went into production, but he developed it and finally made, for the first time in Chicago, made 3 prototypes, which would be powered, this one by a Ford V8 engine, a 3-wheeled car, front wheel drive, rear wheel steer, which made it enormously flexible in terms of parking and maneuverability.
In Bridgeport, Connecticut, to produce this new ground taxiing car of the unmanned medium transport, because it just couldn't go on the ground. I knew people would call it an automobile, but it wasn't designed just to be an automobile at all. She was so extraordinarily stable. My center of gravity was very, very low, and for the first vehicle that ever had the center of gravity forward at the midpoint of the wheelbase. It did prove to be a very good vehicle, and did have very high efficiency with 11 passengers. I averaged over 22 miles per gallon, sometimes as much as 30, but 11 passengers is very, very high. A hot-steer car with the kingpins could only steer at 34 degrees angle. My rear rudder post I could turn so I could give it 90 degrees rudder if I wanted. This meant when I want to come into the park, there'll be a space just, say, 6 inches longer than my Dymaxion car. I'd simply bring my nose into the curve and then throw my rear wheel sideways and she'd run and drop like that.
Now, I want to explore a little bit further this idea of sort of lines and fields of force, because that idea moved from the 4D work that we've been looking at, which was really designed as a system, we say, of habitation and transportation primarily, but that idea moved into the more abstract realm of what Fuller would later call synergy, which is, as he defines it here in this sketch, and this is one of the drawings, it's one of my favorite drawings in the show, where he defines synergy as this behavior of whole systems made up of interrelated, interconnected parts. Just another quick quotation, where he, again, moves away from he moves away from architectural concerns, but toward concerns of movement and pattern. He says both man and universe are complex aggregates of motion. Space itself is meaningless. We have relations, but not space. And I think, again, I'm keep stopping because I'm hearing Bob breathing down my shoulder of using Fuller to make an anti-architectural argument. This is not, I hope you understand this is not my intention. What I'm trying to make is not an architectural argument, but it's a different kind of argument that I think architects can learn from and absorb into their own practice. That's one point. The main point is that though it became famous as the most stable structural system available, Fuller's geodesic system must be understood first in this context as an abstraction of this geologic that I've been describing first in more practical terms. Consider, sorry, I'm not there yet. We'll first go to the, he starts he invents, I'm not going to go through this kind of invention of the Dymaxion map, but with the Dymaxion map, he starts to use the map as a way of plotting and registering these patterns, these global patterns that I've been talking about. And he famously published in Forbes magazine, these are sketches that later graphic designers put together in Forbes magazines of population, the way population interacts with resource availability and distribution and manufacturing. And he started to try to trace at a global scale this interaction of resources and population and information. One of his projects that most interests me, beginning with the World Game, this is a map put down on the gymnasium floor where sort of students could try to trace out different, again, resource distribution. But the point was he tried to imagine a device that could look at the interaction of these different systems so that you could see the consequences of sort of going to war would deplete certain resources, would cause rainfall where it shouldn't be, and it would have these kind of consequences. The device that he imagined would register that, which he was never able to build, he called the geoscope. He worked with faculty and students at Cornell and other places building prototypes. But one of the sketches that I like very much that shows up in the show is that he imagined putting this geoscope, which again shows the global consequences of different seemingly unrelated decisions, like going to war, like raising the price of oil, and he would imagine that he would float one or anchor one in the East River outside the United Nations building that would light up every time the United Nations would make some decisions about like going to war or raising the price of oil. They could see the global consequences of their actions, of their votes. The Expo, the U.S. Pavilion at Montreal 67, Expo 67, his original idea was that it would be one of these giant geoscopes. He envisioned building his geodesic dome with millions of small lights on the inside, and these lights would be controlled by giant IBM mainframe computers, which would already have been available by then. The lights would be controlled to show these global patterns in real time, speeded up or slowed down, so that even you could see the effects over time of these interactions of different systems. And the technology, of course, simply wasn't there, but also it was very clear that the United States government was not thinking globally at this time. They didn't want to this kind of information. Of course, it's been pointed out by other people that something that comes very close to the geoscope is, of course, the war rooms in World War, used in World War II. And this drawing, which shows a figure that he called vector equilibrium, shows again a kind of proto-geodesic structure, not as a stabilizing fixed globe, but as a system of vectors and movements. This is my point. That while it could be, these models could turn into domes, they were primarily maps of what he thought were fundamental forces that shape themselves in geometrical patterns. Now, I'll give you a very quick example of how vector equilibrium, which is the simplest unit, is the primary unit of the system that I'm trying to describe. If you take a single sphere and surround it by the minimum number of spheres that will be stable, there will be 12 spheres surrounding a single sphere. if you take the vertices of each of those spheres, the center of each of those spheres, and connect them, they will connect with lines all equal distance, including the center. So the center of each sphere, including the center sphere, connects to all the others with lines that are equal distance. He called this vector equilibrium. And it was the most fundamental unit of what became the geodesic system. And it's in drawings like this, and really these drawings, they show up very, very small in the exhibition, but they're really worth spending some time with. From these geometrical figures, he tries to derive the kind of mathematical patterns. And Fuller did not use high-level mathematics. It was all basically arithmetical patterns, but that he would derive. So he's thinking in terms of patterning, repetition, and recursive systems. So this geodesic system could be turned into a dome. It could be turned into a map, but it should primarily be understood not as a structural solution, but rather as the map of a kind of cosmic machine. And it sponsored some of Fuller's most beautiful projects and some of the most beautiful drawings in the exhibition as he developed these. And notice how these geometrical figures, of course, nest in one another in different ways and develop out of one another in different ways. I'll show you without too much comment just some of the studies. And these are primarily working models. This is one of the more beautiful ones of how these complex geometries nest within one another and can be generated out of one another. This is the next level. This is when you take the 12 around one sphere and go to the next level. This is a very large piece in the show. And then these, which you'll also see made out of copper wire, are negatives. They're the negative space within these figures, the space that appears in between the spheres. It's trying to map those and find the property of those. Oops, sorry. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about the Dymaxion house. It followed from the 4D house. It kept many of the same principles, including the central service core, which was now still used for service, but no longer was needed for structure. The innovation of this Dymaxion house, beyond the 4D house, was starting to use natural ventilation. You can see this large kind of wind funnel on the top. It was to use natural ventilation to draw air underneath the house and through the house and then out the wind funnel. So again, thinking of energy efficiency, obviously, but continuing to develop along the earlier lines. This working model is in the show. But this, I don't know what to do with this. So Dana, my co-curator, and I found one black and white photograph in the archives with no notes, no date, and became kind of obsessed with it. And I had Harvard students from the photograph build, I think I'm not, yeah. So to build a model of this Dymaxion suburb, when it came to collective living, Fuller couldn't quite use the Dymaxion. He tried to stack the houses. He tried to distribute these houses in a suburb. What that led to, this is still, we think this must still be in the 30s or 40s. We couldn't find a date. But that did lead to thinking about larger scale collective habitations, beginning with this project which was to put a geodesic dome over Manhattan. He imagined, because the individual buildings of Manhattan waste so much energy, he said, that by covering a large area, you could obviously make the energy use more efficient. And he prophesied that the savings in snow removal alone could pay for the structure. And that was how he was going to sell it. Now, Fuller was not the only one in the 60s, and this one, the tetrahedral city, done with Shoji Sadao, for projects that could be floated in San Francisco Bay, or there's another version that floats in, this one is planned for Tokyo Bay, there's another one for San Francisco Bay. These are really continuations of the same idea of the 4D house. I read you that description of the 4D house as a plug in a network. The other way he described it was an energy valve, that it's the kind of nexus of all these intersecting materials and movements and flows. And he said that the concept of energy valve should work at the level of the city as well as at the level of the single dwelling. So these were giant energy valves that would actually would be movable, could come up to a city, but could also float like a giant, luxury liner out into the ocean and move from place to place. This one, I think, housed like something like 3,000 people. Now, just to remind you, there were other people doing similar projects in the 60s. My point's going to be the same, that these projects were mainly kind of cultural critiques and in terms of architectural codes. Fiona Friedman's famous spatial city. Stanley Tigerman did a project in the mid-60s for a tetrahedral city that would float in the lake. Of course, there was Kinzo Tange's project for Tokyo Bay as well. And famously, Super Studios, No Stop City, Super Studio, Archigram, Cedric Price, Constant, and the rest. Now, technology and social program are preoccupations, but the architectural forms are still the primary concerns. And in contrast, in Fuller's projects, Archigram, which explicitly learned from Fuller, Heron's Walking City. I'm assuming most of you know these. I like this image because it's Archigram, but see the crane at the top? I feel sure that somehow that crane is related to the one I showed you before, this time using the building to kind of assemble itself, and a kind of, also kind of assured obsolescence. It's the nature of a geodesic sphere that the larger it gets as the ratio of inside volume changes to surface area. If it gets large enough, Fuller calculated something like 2 miles in diameter, the slightest heat differential inside would actually float the structure, would overcome, because the volume of air inside is so great relative to surface area, or the other way around, that the slightest heat differential would float the structure, would overcome the weight of the structure, and he imagined that these city balloons in sort of post-terrestrial world could be used, but again he describes these as energy valves. I have nothing to say about this except it's a poem that John Cage wrote Fuller for his 80th birthday, I think. Fuller had met Cage at Black Mountain College, claimed to have been very influenced by Fuller, but I think again my point was that Fuller is of a generation where a generation of people who could still think totalities, who still tried to think totalities, and I think it would be extremely interesting, it would take much more work to sort of start to think about the connections of Cage, beyond the biographical connections of Cage and Fuller, of Merce Cunningham, who was also a friend of Fuller's, of Robert Smithson's relationship to Fuller, to fill out this point. want to show you just a few more objects without comment. These are from Southern Illinois University, Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Kind of exquisite models. Fuller kept what he called the Dymaxion chronophile. Every bit of correspondence, every sales receipt for his entire life is housed in hundreds of linear feet of these things. So I think a new generation of architects who might, of architects and designers who might rediscover Fuller may be inspired. They won't be inspired by issues of self-conscious formal reflexivity or spatial invention or radical cultural critique. I think there's a real danger that the inspiration will be a kind of positivist and moralist idea of nature. But Fuller's idea of nature was very different from the idea of a natural perfection, which we have to strive to maintain. He understood nature as a dynamic, never stable, always evolving, always continuing process. But of course, I'm afraid that the more positivist, moralist version will be the lesson. I think other architects will discover kind of sources of inspiration for maybe what is the other side of sustainability, the issue of sustainability in design, which is parametrics. But I hope it will be, and I think that's not wrong, but I hope, because this idea of forces coming into shapes, but I hope it won't be the parametrics that are kind of just found in softwares, but will be parametrics that are to be discovered rather than the ones already found. But I think the real inspiration will be, I hope, by this modeling of a globalized system of contingency and structure, organization and change, things entering into structures in local instances, then breaking apart and moving back into a larger system of temporary stability, but also constant renewal. This is Fuller's own prediction. The great aesthetic which will inaugurate the 21st century will be the utterly invisible quality of intellectual integrity. The integrity of the individual dealing with his discoveries. The integrity of the individual dealing with conceptual realization of the comprehensive interrelatedness of all events. The integrity of the individual dealing with the only experimentally arrived at information regarding these invisible phenomena. And finally, integrity of all those who formulate the invisibility with their respective minds, and invisibility with mathematically dimensionable advanced technologies, but formulate them on behalf of their fellow men. So such is the promise of Fuller's geological diagram. Thank you. Bob says I have to ask if you want questions. I don't know if you have questions. No, I'm kidding. I would be happy to.
A lot of what you have mentioned today seems to echo. A lot of what you have mentioned today seems to echo the talk that Zachary Quinter gave last semester. What do you think is the relationship between Fuller and Quinter? Is Quinter, in your opinion, in some way inheriting some of the ideas of Fuller, or what do you think along those lines?
Well, Stanford's made it very, very clear. Remember that I don't know if you know, there was an Any publication, special issue on Fuller, and Stanford was really the only one who was not so much, he was the only one who was not overly critical. More than that, he actually used Fuller as Quinter's been pretty clear that Fuller for him is the undiscovered savior of architecture. I think what he sees in Fuller, I think you're right, is very close to something that I was talking about today, which Sanford is interested primarily, I think, in the evolution of patterns and how patterns move and change and evolve, right? But I think also how they register certain fundamental forces, as I was saying. So I think that's right. For me, I guess for me, I would have to be very careful that I want architects to re-script Fuller rather than let Fuller, because there's real danger in going toward an absolutely sort of positivist, anti-formal argument. You can also get that from Fuller. What I want to stress is that, and the reason I think the one point I was trying to make was that what I'm calling the geodesic structures, or these forms that emerge out of Fuller, should really be, I don't think they're architectural forms, but I think they're forms that trace forces, and that architects can re-script that idea on their own. And I think Sanford, for me, misses that slightly mediating step. I think Sanford is happy to make an anti-architectural argument. He has made anti-architectural arguments. I'm not willing to use Fuller to do that, if that makes sense. I think Fuller is one of many resources that young architects can use. I think the Fuller, the myth of Fuller, that I think I was probably the last, my generation was the last generation to remember Fuller alive. But I think the myth of the kind of 60s, 70s Fuller as, savior of humanity, we're trying to re-script with this exhibition, and I think further re-scripting needs to be done by design. It will happen that a very naive and positive sense of sustainability will be the lesson that we'll try to get from return to Fuller's work. But we should be suspicious of that because of Fuller's own model and conceptualization of nature and ecology was much more dynamic and much more complicated, I think, than the ones that we're tending toward right now, which are much more formulaic and moralistic. He was never moralistic in that way.
You talked about the relationship between Fuller's global theories and theories about nature. Have you talked about the relationship between these global theories and the theories of globalization, of economic globalization? Do you see any difference?
Well, they were connected together. And the problem is, the only concrete data, we used economic data, was in that Forbes magazine article. And I think frankly, the editors of Forbes were also feeding him that data. So I think that there was never a concrete example where you could show how economic.
Except in the world game, right?
But that's what he wanted to map. He claimed to be able, in principle, to map that. Yeah, exactly, in the world game. But I don't have a concrete example. I mean, he would give the hypothetical examples like I was giving that, it might be a bad thing to grow too much cotton in this country because it would deplete the resources, some certain resources in such a way that it would harm another country, and they could only, and even though the money might be flowing this way, there's money being taken away elsewhere, but you could only see that not just by looking at interactions of seemingly unlike forces, but also, and this is really interesting, that maybe you had to speed up the effects of the growth of cotton or slow down the economy to see that they were related, right? So he envisioned you could actually speed up patterns, slow down patterns, also collect them in real time. I mean, and it's fascinating. We're almost able to do that now. You know, I think for me the geoscope, we're coming very close with Google Earth, right? If you imagine like a massively detailed Google Earth inside a dome, but one that you can zoom in on, right, and pull out data, you know, expand data, like you know, get telephone numbers and stuff. So I somehow am getting very close to that. And I guess I guess it was obvious, but I didn't say it. The millions of lights that he imagined, of course, are nothing more than a video screen. So he had an idea of this, you know, geo-video dome, right?
Did you ever play Simmer? The big Simmer.
Sim?
Simmer.
Oh no, that's the later Sim?
There was
Yeah.
a Simmer that.
Oh, is that what that is?
Did you ever play Simmer?
Oh, I think I know what you're meaning. Yeah. I only played the one where my kid died because I didn't. That was very good.
Well, I went down to the MCA today to see the exhibition, and the MCA is closed on Mondays for those of you. So that's my bad. Although 5 years ago, I saw at the Whitney the show you had done, the Sanctuary's Lost Work with John Hayden. So the curator both of which shows, in terms of visionary projects, Black Mr. Fuller and John Hayden, you can find any connection between them.
You know, I hadn't thought about. I should have thought about that. I think there may be some. This that I don't know exactly how I ended up doing my first show on John Hayden. I did for very clear reasons why I wanted to do that. The Fuller show was something that I co-curated that emerged more out of a kind of dialogue. So I don't think they were directly. There was no direct connection in my own mind. However, I think one could almost make a kind of yin and yang, because I think for me, Hayden was after the same kind of depth of the kind of depth in terms of pure architectural culture, the depth, but also the resonance of something that's purely architectural. He thought that architecture, he thought you could find architecture as an impulse in literature, in painting, and in everyday life. And that for him, architecture had an almost ontological status that was so powerful and so deep that you didn't need anything much more. And in some way, Fuller is the other side of that. I think with a similar concern of kind of the depth of connections, but with everything in a way around architecture. So I think one could construct, but it would not be in terms of similarities. It would be in terms of almost figure ground relation. I'm sorry that I haven't really thought through that. I guess. I mean, Fuller, I didn't mention that because I thought probably it's obvious that he was not proper. We shouldn't think of him properly as an architect or a scientist or a mathematician, or a philosopher, but rather of all those things. It's exactly that kind of cutting across fields that I think is Fuller's potential for us, whereas Hayden's, I think, is going very, very deep into a single field rather than cutting across. But maybe they end up somehow meeting.
Michael, how would you, I mean, not wanting people to take from the show, particularly perhaps architects, like architects, musicians, which I think we understand. How do you think the show, does the show, and the show guard against the general public taking away that
Yeah.
positivistic, moralistic, possibly
Yeah.
there's that other side. Given it,
No, I met some students, some UIC students earlier today, and I think that was their concern, too. And I think that's say that to say I think that's a real concern. But look, is it not true that, well, two things. One, when you do a big museum show that's distinct from a smaller gallery show that has a, let's say, a specifically architectural audience or whatever, there is some obligation to spread out at the risk of oversimplifying. Okay. On the other hand, isn't it true? I mean, it's certainly true that we have issues that are absolutely urgent, that I think most of the population are still only just waking up to. And I think it's that audience is absolutely fine if they come away with, we really need to do something about our use of resources, right? I think architects, we've been talking about ecological issues for decades. And I think, on the other hand, we're right to resist simplified and one-dimensional answers. But I think simplified and slightly mono-dimensional answers for large, not answers, issues for a large part of the population may be okay. I don't know. I mean, I know that, I mean, we hit the problem is we hit it just right. We've been working on this show for almost 5 years, and within those 5 years, we now have green Lexuses that use more energy than normal Lexuses, right? And green makeup that, and green baby products that is purely about marketing. I understand that. And that's very, very recent. Maybe that goes again. But I still think to show that there are precedents to our ecological concern for a large museum-going audience, not an academic audience, and not an architectural audience. I guess I don't feel so bad about that.
No, but my concern would be, I mean, I thoroughly understand that would be an anti-architectural backlash.
Oh, I see, by the larger population.
As part of the anti-Wall Street,
Yeah.
I mean, as a kind of further trend against expertise.
I don't know. I think we have to. Bob, I just read a piece by Bob where he says that for a long time architects, lamented that they only had 5% of buildings, and now they're taking responsibility for the other 95%. And this combination of powerlessness and responsibility, and we keep getting ourselves in this situation, which is sort of what you're describing. I don't know, Sharon. I think that people who follow the Fuller, show and catalog and the press, I think that the issues will be rich enough that intelligent people will. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, what do you do? Even Sunday's trip article, it wasn't, it made all the right points. Those points just need to be complicated. So.
You speak to the issue of these networks and forces. What specifically might they live more comfortably in? Are they part of architectural discipline? Do they belong in another discipline? Is there a meta-discipline that they should be part of?
See, that's the thing. This is where I think architects are it's the single discipline that isn't ready to deal with. I think writing is really good at constructing and organizing unrelated things into coherent narratives or fictions that open up ways of thinking that didn't exist before that piece of writing. But writing, because it's such a specific kind of medium, this material is very little, can do that probably best, but only exception. Architecture is next best. Architecture organizes theory, unlike materials, unlike events, unlike spaces, unlike things into coherent shapes and forms. So I actually think we're the ones, architects are the ones who should be taking this up, taking it in a way away from Fuller into architecture. I think we're the best equipped. I don't think I think architecture is the meta discipline. Honest Meyer said, slightly different, but that architects were specialists in generalization, right? And I think I think architects should refuse to be specialists and become these kind of multi-dimensional organizers. I think that's what we do best. And with very little information, also with very little kind of data. I'll make say one more thing. But I think that's the challenge, because it's not going to be geographers and it's not going to be data management people. It's not going to be them. We are the metaphysics.
How do we get more young people involved?
How do we get more young people involved in the field of architecture? Yeah, and especially in this economy. No, we worry about that. But I also a lot too. And I know what's happening. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you can hear the comment, but it's a really important one. We're all in this room insisting that architecture has some kind of privileged place to deal and conceptualize some of these problems, but how do we get more young people involved in architecture? We at Harvard, we're large enough that we actually have summer programs and sometimes kind of spring break programs that go out into local communities to high schools to kind of, to show them what architecture can be. Because most smart high school students these days, they want to be lawyers or doctors, even to the ones who are socially conscious, whether they go to law or at best sort of urban policy. But I don't know, I think as educators, we have to find ways of, as college level and graduate school educators, we do have to find ways to recruit. And I don't have good answers, but I think it's very important.
It seems to me that also one of the dangers too of the So sometimes you have like Google Earth or maybe game theory, or maybe just the internet. It's kind of a visualization of these relationships. That programs architecture does not take a holistic approach to it, but maybe once these relations are closed, then fall back into that kind of architecture. They have an ideological position.
No, it's really, again, I don't know if you heard the question. Is an architecture which takes a critical position, which engages in cultural issues, as opposed to, one would say maybe cultural issues, but not in the deeper kind of sense of the medium, but engages in cultural issues that can still have a critical stance. Is that incompatible with what we see in Fuller? And no, and this is no. That's what has to be. That's what I say. Architects have to re-script it. We have to take it into architecture. And I think the idea of codes, I don't know where I stand on that. It's very clear to me that Fuller was able to think in certain ways because he wasn't interested in a self-reflexive kind of form, a kind of self-conscious formal reflection that relies on codes and internalizing sort of content to become form, right? Kind of self-reflection where the material becomes a form. And he was able to do things because he avoided that. But it seems to me that's just what would be the next step. How do you bring this kind of thing? And this is back to whoever asked the question about Sanford Quinter. I think for Quinter too, it seems like to me that Sanford's not able to sometimes bring his most fruitful thinking into the form where it gets coded materially, spatially, tectonically, because then it kind of stalls. But that would be, for me, the next step. I have no idea what that looks like, but I also think that here's where digital design tools could be a tool, and because the other risk, to me, the other risk from idealizing and stabilizing nature is idealizing a software that seems to give you things that look like this without any effort. However, as a tool, the digital medium, the digital design machinery may be the tool we need to start bringing those things together. I'm not sure. Those are obviously being two sides that are looking more and more like two sides of a similar syndrome, right? That maybe could be somehow folded back together. Whatever that might be. Thanks very much.